And welcome everyone to another one of our monthly evening events. I see we've got some new faces that our speakers I think have attracted in, which is fantastic. I was really struck by the title of the, you changed your title to Widening the Business School. What about shutting down?
Actually, sorry, just move past that one. That was a previous talk.
Oh right, good. You're on the right talk. I was like, yes, shut down the business school. The sheer provocation of it seemed to be really exciting and interesting. So I tracked down Martin, and he very kindly agreed to speak. He's had a long career working in business schools, so if anyone knows that they need shutting down, it's him. And I think he has a diverse set of interests, and which will bring a lot of life, etc., to the presentation. So, Martin, would you like to...
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So, I mean, I haven't actually had that long a career in business schools, really, and that's part of the point. That it's the best place for me not to stand in front of there. If I go, I'll go here. You go there. I'll go there. Sort things out. That my background is in sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, stuff like that, and I ended up kind of accidentally, really, 20 years ago, working in a small school of management. So part of the context for this really is that I've always felt something of a stranger in schools of business and management. They're not my home in a way. And I guess a lot of my writing over the past 20 years has been kind of exploring that strangeness and increasingly getting worried about the effects that business schools are having on ways in which people think about business management, organisation, marketing, economy, and so on. Yeah. So I've been griping about this stuff for a long time, usually in fairly small pieces, and then last summer I had a particularly unpleasant summer just writing all my gripes down. So this book is basically a kind of an extended moan, but hopefully, as David from Pluto will undoubtedly attest, a fairly provocative one. As I was just saying to him, when I was approaching him about the possibility of doing this book, he wanted a very straightforward title. And obviously I was a little worried about something like that, because business schools do pay my mortgage. And it was a bit like David was kind of pushing me towards the school bully, really, saying, go on, hit him, it'll be fine, I'll be behind you, it'll be all right. So thanks for that. So, shut down the business school. So I'll just do kind of 15, 20 minutes or so, which is basically going to be a kind of summary of the arguments in the book. Andre Spicer from Cass Business School is there, has kindly agreed to sort of respond in some way. Both Andre and I, we're going to hopefully have a heated debate, but Andre and I come from an area of the business school which is usually called something like critical management studies. So a bunch of people who inhabit the business school and enjoy its largesse, but nonetheless bite the hand that feeds them at every possible opportunity. Indeed, Andre and I have been gnawing obsessively at this hand for quite a long time now, but it hasn't smacked us yet. Okay, so next slide, thank you. Oh no, we'll go past that one. I was going to show that, but forget that, doesn't matter. We'll go to the next one. Yeah, that's fine. No, back. That's right. So it's worth saying a little bit about the history of the business school, I think, because it's kind of important to place it in context. How many people here have studied at business schools? There's a few. Okay, so there's three. So most of you, and one over there. So most of you don't have much experience in the business school, and it's kind of important to place them in sort of historical context, particularly now that something like 1 in 7 students at UK universities are studying versions of business and management, and that's an astonishing number, and reflects a really important sea change in the way that universities imagine themselves and the kind of knowledge that they sell, and also the kind of political economy that they find themselves within. One of the arguments that I quite often use now is I don't think it would have been possible at the start of austerity to reduce the university block grant and effectively privatise universities in the way that they have been over the last decade without the financial income coming in from business schools, because that's very substantial and effectively is propping up universities at the moment. If it wasn't for very large master's courses sold to overseas students at £25,000, £30,000 a pop, then most universities would be technically bankrupt. There's very few that wouldn't. And there's also a strange sense, I think, in which the business school has acted as the kind of ideological shock troops of marketisation within the university, because it's been a successful business model in terms of generating cash for the university, keeping the chemistry department open, etc. I'm sorry if there's any chemists in the audience. But that's then kind of legitimated a particular way of talking about customers and products and markets and marketing and so on. Yeah? The business school is usually imagined to be an American invention. It's not. It's an European invention and really dates from a period when you're starting to see the emergence of essentially a kind of a bourgeois urban class. And the business schools, particularly the business schools I've mentioned here, then become ways of selling both practical skills for money, but also of beginning to talk about the kind of morality of that practice too. The sense of moral education is actually quite important in early business school stuff. And particularly in the United States, it's a really important theme in understanding how some of those early business schools grew. So next slide, thank you. So the Americans who like to claim that they invented business schools were in a sense reinventing European models, but adding to that a particular sort of version of almost kind of moral rearmament. The idea somehow that the figure of the business person was a politically and morally troubling one. And remember, we're talking about a context in which there's plenty of examples of business scandals, of shoddy practices, of large companies dominating markets, and so on. So many of the early business schools, Wharton is usually seen to be the first one, have a very strong narrative of trying, almost like a kind of civilizing process in a sense, of trying to articulate the character of the business person and to put the business person on a similar kind of level to other professions. Yeah? So to articulate the business person as somebody who could be compared at some point in the future to a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. That they would have some kind of professional code, some sort of ethics which would allow them to practice their trade in ways that didn't damage either the interests of customers or their fellow business practitioners. Okay? Next one, please. Now, since those early beginnings, and particularly in northwestern Europe, since really kind of the post-Second World War period, what we see is a really explosive expansion of business schools globally. So if the market was made in the States, in a sense that's where we see, by that kind of 1930, 1940, most of the large US universities had business schools already. Effectively, it's in the post-war period that you start to see this particular form being exported to pretty much every country in the world. In the UK, the business school market, the first business schools kind of date from really sort of 60s, sort of 50s and 60s, but effectively the really rapid expansion begins to take place in the 1980s, 1990s. And in pretty much the same way as it did in the States in the 1930s, by something like 2000, virtually every university in the UK had got itself a business school. Okay, this was it was de rigueur to have one, and increasingly important in terms of the revenue streams from universities, from different departments in universities. Counting this market is obviously difficult. It's potentially an enormous market. An American Association of Business Schools estimated 13,000 business schools across the world. If we do a little bit of maths based on average size of business schools and various other things, you get to a fee income of something like 400 billion annually. Remember, this is just the fee income globally for business schools. Okay, that's a pretty conservative estimate, I think, and the number of business schools continues to grow. If you add to that other ancillary parts of this market, because obviously business school students are spending lots of money on doing other things as well as the market for textbooks and various consultancy services and research and all that kind of stuff, you're into a gigantic figure. What's kind of important for me about that is the way in which it's a remarkably recent and relatively stealthy development, in a sense. The idea that there is a form of knowledge which is so ubiquitous and now so global that it can be described as relatively homogeneous. And that's kind of where the book kicks off from, really. The idea that, in describing this gigantic market and these sets of, huge sets of institutions, in most UK universities, the business school will be the largest department in the university. It's the one that will employ the most staff, it'll have the most students, etc. Somebody, I'm not sure if this figure is correct, but somebody told me in Australia now, 1 in 3 students are studying versions of business. I don't know whether that figure's right, but if it's true, that's pretty astonishing. Next one, please. Thank you. So, of course, then, given that most of you have never set foot within the hallowed halls of business schools, let me tell you a bit about what I think they do. Now, in doing this, I am generalising hideously. Okay, this is London Business School, which, next slide, please, advertises itself in this sort of way. Usually an appeal to the student as consumer, often the kind of the sort of rhetoric that's employed is a kind of return on investment. Come to our business school, pay the gigantic fees that we've got. In London's case, was it £78,500 or something for the MBA? Bloody hell. Buy a house in Stoke for that. Sorry, I used to live in Stoke. That wasn't just a random mention of Stoke. But it's true. You could buy a whole street in Stoke for that. But an appeal to the student as consumer. Yeah? And the idea that if you invest in yourself by spending all this cash, that investment will pay off. Yeah? And it will pay off in terms of the kind of jobs you move into, the kind of salary you'll get, the kind of career you'll have, etc., etc. Cue lots of pictures of excitable people in suits jumping on and off planes and running in and out of glassy buildings and all that kind of stuff. That's the marketing pitch, basically. Come and study with us. Your life's going to be great. Yeah. Next one, please. So, what do they actually teach? Because most of you won't have been there. Now, I'm distilling business school teaching down to these 3 principles. Okay, I know. What I want to say in defence, in advance, is essentially that this, I think, is what most business schools teach most of the time in most parts of the world. Okay, there are exceptions, and there are examples of people who do different stuff in this room. But the tone of most business school teaching effectively is shaped by, I think, these 3 sets of assumptions. So let me just very briefly explore them. First of all, there's an assumption that the default model of organising is the capitalist corporation. Yeah, that's effectively articulated as the most efficient, the most effective engine for driving economic growth, innovation, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And it's an assumption that obviously relies on a set of ideas about the way that particular form of capitalism develops, and also on the importance of thinking about practices that enhance shareholder value. Okay, because that's effectively almost like the kind of the poster child organisation. That's the organisation that most people assume most of the time is the most important one. Anything else is a bit irrelevant. And so case studies, for example, would tend to concentrate on this kind of stuff when you're talking about managerial practices or strategies, or whatever it might be. The examples that would be given would be of the strategizing that mostly multinational corporations would engage in various ways. So there's a curious sense then, I think, in which by focusing on corporations, you also then embed a second assumption. Not all corporations are big, but most of them are. Most of the ones we know about. And this embeds the idea of growth as being a particular kind of imperative. So the bigger, the larger your turnover, the larger your profitability, the larger number of managers or customers or countries that you operate in, or whatever it is, all of these are assumed to be virtues. Because growth is simply assumed to be both the means and ends for success in this particular kind of game. And the third one I want to comment on is the importance of the idea of management. And here thinking about management as a particular set of assumptions about the rights and privileges and knowledges of a group of people within the organisation, the managers. The assumption is that management is always necessary in all forms of organising, which effectively assumes a couple of things. One of them is effectively a hierarchical model of organisation. That in itself assumes a kind of information asymmetry within the organisation. In other words, that those at the top know more about stuff than those at the bottom. They're the ones who are capable of doing the strategy stuff. Everybody else is a bit thick. And also the idea that the asymmetries of basically of pay, reward, status and so on are somehow naturally occurring because of the ubiquity of managerial forms of organisation. Okay? So I think, again, at risk of generalising hugely, that these three assumptions are built into 95% of the stuff that business schools do globally. So a quick way of saying that would be, what do business schools do? Well, they teach capitalism. They teach a particular form of corporate capitalism. And this, effectively, is then being presented as if it were a form of knowledge that is ubiquitous, generalisable, a necessary outcome of certain kinds of functional arguments about organisations or economies or whatever else it might be. Okay, next please. Thank you. Now I think, for a variety of reasons, that capitalism has a series of problems in terms of ideas about inequality. Next please. The domination of the global economy by a relatively small number of large corporations. Next please. The externalities that capitalism produces routinely and that are embedded into ideas about shareholder value in the corporate form. And next please. And the kind of species-threatening climate change that faces all of us, whether we like it or not. So capitalism is a particular economic form which has, I think, some deep structural problems associated with it. Next please. Now, even if you only partly agree with my argument here, and you may not agree with any of it, the question it raises for me is, what are business schools doing? Are they providing education in some general sort of liberal sense, the kind of idea of, the classic idea of the university that many of us would be familiar with and kind of defend in some general sense? Or is effectively what they're doing a kind of an ideological form, an ideological subterfuge? Okay, next please. Now the key bit of the kind of hinge of the argument in the book, in a way, is to suggest that if we want to get out of this particular problem, this myopia about what's the proper status and nature of business and management, what we need to do is turn to a different kind of term. And the term I much prefer is organising. Organising, just defined in the most general sense as how people and things come together, to do stuff, to make value, whatever it is. Organising varies, and organising is not the same as management. Management is one particular form of organising, but they are not equivalent. We can't treat management as if it was the same as organising. Next, please. Organising, I think, is about patterning across time and space, with the production of organisations, with the kind of the generation of more or less enduring constellations of people and things. And in that sense, I think it's a much more generous term, a much more helpful term, a term that will allow us to explore diversity and difference rather than simply concentrating on one organisational form. Okay. Now, back in the 1960s, sociologists of education used to talk about this idea of the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum is very often, the idea that the curriculum was too white or too male-dominated and so on. So, you just talk about, when he talked about science, he just talked about men and not about women scientists, or when he talked about history, he just talked about white people, not about black people, and so on. So the notion of the hidden curriculum, in a sense, develops the idea that what schooling in the most general sense does is not only an explicit process, it's also an implicit process in terms of what gets left out. So if we apply this notion of the hidden curriculum to the business school, what do we see? What don't we see? Well, we don't see a whole load of actually existing economic forms which are alternatives to the way in which conventional forms of corporate capitalism operate. Just to pick one really obvious one, the cooperative. Okay? Most business schools don't teach about cooperatives, whether, however we might articulate them, producer, consumer, worker, owner, whatever. The cooperative is an enduring form. It's one, the Co-ops UK, in its latest report, says there's something like 7,500 co-ops in the UK, billions of pounds worth of value generated for the economy. There are various estimates because of the number of large agricultural co-ops around the world, but something like 1 billion people across the world either work in or benefit from the activities of the cooperative form. But you wouldn't know that if you went to a business school. You wouldn't know that this alternative actually existed and has endured for for roughly 2 centuries. Neither would you know anything about a whole variety of other ways in which the economy might be understood, many of them being pretty enduring, pretty challenging, rather important ways in which we might think about the production of collective value. Okay. That's a curious sense, is if we turn back to the idea of the university, that then what we've got here is basically a department that's excluding almost everything that it could talk about apart from corporate capitalism. And you wouldn't really, you wouldn't buy this in most other departments of most other universities, would you? So, the metaphors I use here, a history department that only teaches about some bits of history, or a geography department that, concentrates on certain parts of the world but ignores others, or a medical school that, only treats certain kinds of people, or just works with people's feet and their hair or something like that, yeah? Because that's effectively what the business school is doing. It's by ignoring a huge variety of other organisational forms, by effectively making them part of the hidden curriculum, it's implicitly suggesting that they don't matter, that they're unimportant. Now, when I was doing some of this stuff a while ago, I happened to have this book which my mother-in-law had given me about plants and flowers, and I was just sort of leafing through it, and I was just thinking about this sort of idea of diversity, really, just the notion of diversity. So, this is a big old fat old, and it's got big trees and tiny things and things that, different plants that reproduce in different sorts of ways and live in different kinds of environments and all the rest of it. So, if you want to understand something about the plant world, beyond some stuff about, I suppose, biology and chemistry and so on, what we see is diversity, okay? And this, it seems to me, is precisely with the kind of a principle that's missing in business school. The idea of a kind of an experimental approach, an approach that looks for difference, that looks for a variety for different ways in which people solve their collective problems. And that, it seems to me, should be the proper task of what we currently call the business school. Now, a couple of years ago, I and some other people did some work on this, and we decided we were going to produce a dictionary of alternatives. And this was published by Z about a decade ago. Sorry, it was Z. Yeah, I know. It's useless. Rubbish. And the idea of this was to kind of produce a gigantic array of different organisational forms. And also to add to this, that we're going to have stuff about terrorist groups and imaginary utopias and different experiments in worker self-management and the mafia and all sorts of things. Yeah? The idea was that it was going to be a really dense book in which you could skip from and notice the similarities between hierarchies of angels and managerial hierarchies, or the way that the mafia operate and the way that British American tobacco operate, whatever it might be. Yeah, that was the notion. And we ended up with a book that was 250,000 words long. And Z said, we can't publish this. They said it's too big, you have to cut it. And so what we ended up doing was dumping half of the book. So there's another half of book. another half of book here. But this is what we ended up with. I think we got them to publish 120,000 words in the end. And so it had all of these different forms of organisation. And here was the joke. It was essentially just a kind of an art piece, really, that management is in there, management's there. Yeah. Management's in there. But management's just one way in which we think about organising. Yeah? It's just one of the ways. And fine, let's talk about it, that's fine, but it's not the only one. Next, please. So the book kind of ends with my attempt to articulate the alternative. And what I suggest is what I'd like to see is, rather than business schools, is schools for organising. Schools for organising which try to deal seriously with the kind of problems that face us. But schools of organising which are based on the principle of exploring the plural, the diverse, the varied, the huge variety of different ways in which people have solved the kind of problems that they face, both historically and spatially. Next, please. And the other thing that the School of Organising would do, and this is really probably the most important, for me at least, the most important part of the book, is to insist that organising is a political matter. That's to say, when we construct organisations, when we think about the rights, the privileges, the relations of exchange, the ways in which people come together to do things, we are conducting politics. Because effectively the most dangerous thing that the business school does is to efface politics. To say that things have to be like this because that's what the bottom line looks like, or because it's efficient to do things in particular kinds of ways. To propose, in other words, that there are a set of kind of inexorable, unavoidable laws or rules that the business school must teach is a way of saying that we, as human beings, can have no discussion about this kind of stuff because that's just the way that the world works. Yeah? So insisting that organising is politics is really, I suppose, the key message of the book. That's it. Thank you.
Over there. Thanks very much, Martin. Well, so business schools are about ideology. Andre, you are in the Cass Business School, and I believe you work a lot in the area of ethics, business ethics, and so on. So actually, are you engaged in ideology?
Of course, we all are. So I thought I'd sort of think about this book in terms of the reactions it might get from some of my colleagues and then work through it. So I'd imagine one of the reactions it might get is what Albert Hirschman, the economist, called the rhetorical reaction, which is to make three arguments, which could be quite easily made about Martin's book. One is his suggestion of shutting down the business school could lead to perverse outcomes, which is it will make matters worse. So let's imagine if we shut down all business schools in the UK, what you're going to do is end up with a whole bunch of locally big chunks of income going out of regional economies where pretty much nothing else going for them apart from a university, and a bunch of people will be made unemployed out of that. The second result, and then what will sort of replace that probably is more lean, exploitative, and difficult capitalist enterprises who won't give people proper jobs. They'll take more money off the students. They won't contribute to local economies in any kind of way. The second thing is the futility of the argument. You could say, well, yeah, shutting down business schools will change multinational capitalism. Somehow I doubt that's going to happen, Martin. By the fact that there are many other factors apart from business schools which have a far higher and more deep influence on the economy working. And the third argument, which was made to kind of radical proposals like this, would be a rhetorical jeopardy, which is this idea that by shutting down a business school, you would endanger and get rid of many of the great and precious accomplishments that business schools have made over the years, whether that's kinds of knowledge, harbouring schools of industrial relations, or whatever you might want to say. So I think all of those arguments potentially are true. There's grains of truth in all of them. But then you might come back with a rhetoric of reform, which Hirschman talks about, which is in some ways kind of, many people would say that the business school can easily be reformed, and this was the argument which you've found in many of the kind of books on business schools. And the problem is that these also rely on rhetorical tricks. One would be the idea that by reforming the business school, everything could be better and everything is going to work together. This is what Hirschman calls the kind of synergy illusion. Everything's going to work together perfectly, and you're going to educate people in more ethical ways of doing business, and we're going to churn out create students who are going to be more ethical and everything's going to be great at the end of the day. Probably not. Things tend to work against each other. The second argument is a rhetoric of imminent danger. The world is going to collapse, everything is coming to an end, and we must change now if we wanted to save the world. Somehow the world's had a sort of habit of going along, and so too capitalist economies. And the third argument is that kind of history is on our side. Sometimes, often, history is more complex than that. I think what Martin offers us in the book is a kind of a rhetoric of radicalism, which is to say, history has been inevitable. It's inevitably pushed in one direction, which is this American business school model. Then there's the argument that there's a totality around that. Things are all sort of working in one direction. There's this kind of list of, business schools educate people as being egoists. They make the multinational capitalist economy being the inevitable model, and there's a few other arguments there. They all work together. And then the only way to liberate us is through this destructive revolutionary impulse. And I think I would question each of those claims. In many ways, if we read the book carefully, there's a few lovely pages where Martin goes through the history of the business school and shows that the history of business schools are rather complex, uninevitable, and very different. So there's these different models of how business schools operated in France. You could add on histories of the English business schools, which came out of all sorts of different kinds of institutions, or Scandinavian business schools, which were about sort of educating people in what they called Fortong's economy, which was civil economy, training civil servants basically, or Austrian business schools, and many other models. Within the US themselves, there's one book which charts out 8 different models of a business school, from Gentlemen's Finishing Club, which is kind of the Wharton model, through to night school, which is people who are going along to get an accountancy qualification at the end of the day. So often the history is rather different and diverse than we think about it. The second argument is about totality. Well, if you actually go and look at what gets taught in business schools, it's far from total. It's very variable in what gets researched there. So if you look at case studies which get taught, they're not just all about multinational corporations. They're often about the co-ops that Martin talks about, feminist clothing networks, or these kind of things are often taught at Harvard Business School. These are some of the most popular case studies which are used. What's researched in business schools, particularly in recent years, if you go and look in the top journals, you'd say somewhere between a third and a half of the articles are written about not multinational enterprises, but various kinds of organizations. And then what would this liberation look like? I don't think kind of knocking down all business schools is necessarily going to be the way forward. It might be about building a whole range of different models of what a business school might look like, from the School of Organising Martin talks about, through to different models of business schools along a particular line, and experimentalism. So I think where the book ends is a kind of a gesture towards Roberto Ungar's idea of opposing false necessity with some degree of institutional experimentalism. And I guess that is where I would encourage is some degree of experimentalism around what a model of the business school looks like. And one of the greatest problems in the world of business schools in the last so many years, I think, has been this increasing convergence on one single model. And I think that's precisely what needs to be challenged, some sort of opening up of different models of what a business school might actually look like. So I think that's the kind of challenge, and that's where Martin ends, and that's where I think a good point for opening the discussion here would be. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrew. Let me put the projector off. That would be a good idea. So we're not sort of... Good. So that'll work. I'll come over here. Still totally central, but there we go. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, both. And now we have a fair amount of time. We're aiming to finish at 8:30, and the wine's on ice. So we've got a reasonable amount of time. So where do people want to start? We've got a question. Jans, 1 second.
Okay, I'll go.
Yeah.
Mix of comment and a question. I've recently heard members of the Labour Front bench referring to neoliberals as market fundamentalists, so that they're rebadging them as market fundamentalists. And in that analysis, the business schools are parallel to madrasas, places of indoctrination in neoliberal thought, in free market thought. So I wouldn't be in favour of trying to close down things, but what I would be in favour of would be if you want to move things in a more profitable direction, what you could do would be to remove any public subsidy of a business school and remove its charitable status. So the income for universities isn't exclusively student fees. It's quite a large proportion is also state grants and other infrastructure. So you could remove that and remove charitable status. So if you wanted a business school along the current lines, which you're perfectly entitled to have, you would simply be in the position of having to fund it 100%. And then you could erect the alternative, where the institution which received public funding and charitable status would be an institution with a wider philosophical base. And by doing that, you would then have when you were appointing, say, to a government job in the Treasury, you could appoint somebody from a business school as it currently is, or from an institution with a much wider philosophical base. So isn't that the route that you could go down to actually, so you would be providing an alternative rather than trying to close down what is this?
And actually incentivising an alternative. Should we have another comment or question? Yes.
Yeah, I've just got a query just based on observation I've noticed. But I had this observation based on when I went into higher education and now looking at sort of my younger family and friends and how they talk about university education, and they're much more materialistic, much more about the dollar. They worship the dollar much more than I did when I finished my A-levels. There's the pressure of debt, huge amounts of debt, or the luster of gold after the MBA. These are the consumers. They're much more conservative socially as well, and they want payback. So how do you get then the institutional experimentalization when we all know that in the capitalist society it's all about what the person that's going to pay.
So we
folks, what do they want?
So we have an alternative organisation, but no one would go to it because they want the money. Adam, sorry.
Yeah, I just like to say thanks for the talk. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, very concise, and I thought the response was interesting too, more in the style. I thought your style was much more rhetorical than Martin's.
Yeah,
because Martin was presenting a very clear argument, whereas you kept just using the word rhetoric over and over again. Very rhetorical. But anyway, the point I really want to make is that actually that illustrates in a microcosm a certain kind of defence, which to me is that on the one hand the business school is teaching kind of a scientific kind of methodology, right? And on the other hand, if you're critiquing something, you're kind of from a humanities kind of background, right? And so immediately there's an asymmetry, okay, and this is what I have in terms of information, supposedly, right? Whereas I think that part of the pluralism has to be, is what this argument that it's politics, is to say that the humanities sort of comes into it. Of course there's political science too, but I think that the pluralism is what's interesting, is how do you from any perspective, when you make some assumptions, you think there's huge variation in what you're looking at, right? In any area of academic life, if you ask a guy what he's doing, you ask a physicist what they're doing, a theoretical physicist, and they'll talk to you about all the massive variation there is in theoretical physics, all these different ideas that they study, and they can spend a lifetime and they've never, ever discover, all there is to know about just the tiny bit that they're studying. It's the same in philosophy, it's the same in actually every single area of academia. You get more and more specialisation. It's entirely, seems to be natural to this way we organise things. Now, if you're making an argument about the need for diversity, the challenge applies to kind of every area of academic life, actually, right? Because we have a specialisation problem. That's what I'm saying is that seems to be a pervasive problem, and business school seems to be a particularly bad example of a bad effect from this lack of genuine cultural diversity within each department. That's what I would say. I don't really.
So we're going into a deeper and deeper hole. We've got an alternative possible way with some incentives, but the customers wouldn't want it. And anyway, the whole of academia is riven with specialisation and lack of diversity. So we're really stuffed. What positive? Because you said also we needed innovation. There seems to be a desire from both you for innovation. But a tendency against it. What are the positive stories to try and how could we get innovation and diversity?
I mean, I think one of the paradoxes in a lot of this stuff is that universities seem to be incredibly effective places for preventing people from talking to one another. You know, they're very good at talking about interdisciplinarity, but in terms of their financial and administrative structures, making sure that doesn't really happen. Now, in some senses, we could say that that's one of the causes for the kind of almost the sequestration of business school from the rest of the university. I and Andre both used to work at Warwick University, and Warwick built itself a big shiny new business school which was facing away from the rest of the campus. And you remember the only way to get in was through that little, but before the extension was built, was through that little back door that was passcard protected. And I always had this idea that it was almost as if, you know, he didn't want the parties were paying loads of money coming in the front to see the grubby rest of the university, but also that there was a kind of symbolically quite interesting. It's like you want the rather expensive knowledge leaking back out again, or something like that. Because literally you had to get in with the passcard, didn't you? So that seems to be happening right the way across UK and global academia. This idea of building the shiny business school building, and that then becomes a place where business school knowledge gets taught. And you know, it's kind of separate from Bristol. Are making precisely the same mistake at the moment. I arrived at Bristol very recently, and they're just about to build they haven't had much business and management there, but they're now talking about building a big new campus down by Templemead Station, where the business school would be. You know, and it's then whatever it is, 2-3 miles away from sociology, politics, philosophy, all the other, you know, all the juicy stuff, because the business school people will be down there, basically flogging expensive courses mostly to Chinese students, and that would be the cash machine, and pays for the rest of the university. Now the paradox of that, of course, and this goes back to your question, is that at the moment the economy of most universities trades on the idea of keeping lots of science departments open by using the income from the business school. The business school doesn't really receive much state subsidy at all, none for students, some for research, but relatively little. If you look at some of the big business schools, the figure would be WBS, probably Warwick say 5% of its income via the state.
It still has charitable status, doesn't it?
Pardon?
Still has a charitable
universities,
status.
yeah, well universities in general
you
do,
could
yes.
that
Not all universities, but most of them do, that's right, yeah. But my point is that at the moment, it's almost the opposite way around, in that, you know, the science subjects, not all of them and not all the time, but many subjects are effectively being kept open because of the income that the business school provides. Now that speaks to a wider problem, I think, because one of the things that some people have said about this book is that this book isn't really about the business school, it's about the marketisation of the university. Yeah? That's really the kind of the topic I'm discussing here. That the ways in which the rather pernicious effects of university markets encourage students to think about themselves in very different ways. I mean, you were talking about, you know, the looking for the dollar and so on. Well, you know, if you're going to be £50,000 in debt, it's kind of economically rational to do that, right? You know, I've got 4 kids. Sorry, I don't know why I laughed at that, but anyway, I've got 4 kids, and you know, they've all gone to university, and you know, the way that they made those decisions, particularly the 2 later ones who are going through on high fees, was of course about shadowed by debt. You know, that's a pretty rational way to be thinking, isn't it? In that sense. So I wouldn't blame students for that. It's an outcome of the economic situation that they find themselves in. And in the same way, universities are now scrabbling around in order to maintain this idea of them being places of general education, beacons of liberal blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff, at the same time as they have to use some parts of their that effectively they have to milk their cash cows aggressively, and the business school is the most effective cash cow. That's the one that's been producing gigantic amount of income for most universities for 15, 20 years now. Yeah.
All right, you were defending business schools in terms of their ability, I thought, to innovate and change possibly. So how can they? Are they, you know, because the suggestion here is they're locked in. What they do at the moment is in some sense an inevitability.
I don't think it is. I mean, if we take the claim which was made here, universities and business schools are madrasas of free market fundamentalism, it's just not the case. If you just go and sit and listen to what people are teaching, look at the courses, look at the journals, you will find that there's actually a lot more variety than that. Let me tell you a small example is we tried to organise an event around shareholder value and corporate governance a while ago and get someone who was championing the idea that the purpose of the corporation is to maximise shareholder values. I tried dozens and dozens of corporate finance professors and I could not find a single corporate finance professor who will defend this. If you go to University of Chicago, which is the centre for the idea that corporations are driven by shareholder value, the people writing at the University of Chicago in the finance department no longer defend this idea. It is dead. Right?
Can I make a point about that? It's a very interesting question, actually. As to, so I just say one quick.
Well, be quick, because
the only point I want to make is that the fact that no one knows that the argument is dead is exactly the defence that you've got. No, because people criticise this idea. Everyone who talks about that idea on Facebook or anywhere says, "What about maximising corporate value?" Inside the business school, we all know that that idea isn't discussed in that black and white way. Yeah. So we can just dismiss all of the criticisms. It's a very interesting effect.
And also corporations are dying. The model of the idea of the corporation, the number of listed companies in the US is going down, and down. Right? So the corporation as a model is declining. So
of course the other
can we sorry.
could be they're merging.
We're open to anarchy
merging,
here.
But actually many of them are going into far worse forms, which is forms of sort of closely held private ownership where you can't tax them and all these kind of things. Okay, so there's one kind of point there. The middle point you made, remove charitable status. Okay, I'll leave that aside. I wouldn't agree with that, but I can't muster arguments for that. The third point you make is, well, then the people that they hire from the Treasury will have a wider range of perspectives. Guess what? The Treasury does not hire people from business schools. You go and hire people from PPE, from Oxford and Cambridge if you want someone who's good at the Treasury. Who do you hire at business school? From business schools, generally speaking, people who are kind of compliant. So if you want someone who's compliant, doesn't ask too much in middle management, there you go and hire someone from a business school, generally speaking. So I think generally speaking, this idea that the masters of the universe or whatever, people who come from business schools, most of the time it's not the case. I just kind of add on to this. One of the questions which Martin was asking, what do people learn at business schools? And he has these different models. Actually, if you look at studies following people, what they've learned at business schools afterwards, sometimes the result is pretty much nothing. They've forgot a lot. One of your boss, I think, Andrew Sturley's, is still your boss?
No, he's not.
No, he's not your boss.
Yeah.
Well, your ex-boss.
Yeah.
The guy who runs used to run the business school at the Department of Management at Bristol, did a study of students who finished Imperial College, I think. And he found that a few years afterwards, they pretty much could remember nothing about what they'd learned. They said none of their knowledge was particularly useful. But what they had learned is how to use business school jargon, right? That's what they'd learned. And through learning that, then they felt comfortable in the business school world. So moving from this were MBA students. And other studies on what people gain from business schools are networks of other people, and there's a kind of the upside of it. There's a quite interesting and smart guy called Gianpiero Pietrogalli who works at INSEAD, the kind of main business school in France, and he says, what do people learn at business school? It's like kind of a therapy event. When people go to do MBAs, most of the time they're having a major career crisis, an identity crisis, and what they gain is some experience of being able to kind of experiment with different identities and hopefully come out at the end of it feeling a bit better about themselves. So business schools are expensive therapy.
And I suppose quite a good cover if you want to protect someone from people realising they're going through a crisis, send them to business school to cover. Can we have any women like to ask a question? Because we haven't got so many women here, but before I... No, you don't have to. Yes, go on. Patricia.
I mean, when you were talking about what I was thinking was that you're talking about changing the values of business schools and the premise on which they work. And what you just said about networks, I used to sit on the board of New South Wales University, and we had Australian Business School, and went through a whole lot of changes, and I was involved in all of that. But the thing that really came to me out of everyone I knew in business who'd gone to Harvard, so the previous generation, was the network thing, and the fact they could use the jargon. And as you said, you know, especially in Australian MBAs, so many of them were going through that crisis. What do we do? Oh, we'll fill in a couple of years, go to business school, looks better. So is that the purpose of business schools? And the other thing listening to you is, I think a lot of our perception of what business schools are is outdated. Absolutely. Just the same as you're talking about shareholder value, which came in the 90s, is not what people are teaching in Chicago anymore. So it's as though we're thinking about business schools, and that's not how they are anymore. So if that's not how they are, how are they?
Okay, we'll take Yanis.
Martin Parker, I think, that raised a problematic issue, and I'd like to suggest an explanation of how this has arisen, and offer a resolution, a personal resolution. We all agree, I'll be as brief as possible, we all agree that there are two ways of describing anything in existence. One is making statements with qualitative or quantitative properties, and the other one is making statements with structural properties. Now, if you examine human intellectual achievements, you'll notice that practically all developments have taken place along the first line in terms of qualitative and quantitative properties or theories incorporating these. There is virtually non-existent structural theory or scenarios. Now, the main proponents of this qualitative, quantitative is conventional science of physics, which predominantly designed or intended to deal with natural phenomena where regularities occur. Now, when all these human activity scenarios have come about, like management and organization and all these things, they are concerned with intensive, purposive activity. Now, when they looked for theories and what to teach and descriptions, there was nothing else but conventional science of physics with the qualitative, quantitative properties, which are not suitable for human activities and scenarios. What is needed is structural theory, because they are structures, dynamic structures. So, and they don't exist.
So how does this, can we take this back to the business school, and what does this?
That is the problem of business schools, because they are trying to teach management and organizations and corporations, and they are all forms of intensive human activities, scenarios, and there is no scenario theory. So they are straitjacketed into teaching what they managed to grab from conventional science or physics, which is no good. So that's where the problem is. So if my remedy now comes along, my remedy is that we have to devise a structural theory, a theory that describes structures, which is universal and teachable and based on existing knowledge, and try and introduce that to change or not introduce novelty into the curriculum, which is suitable, matches the human activities in life.
I'm going to go back to a response now because that was a long statement to remember what they were. But if we go back to that the first question was about, is it all about networking and dealing with
Can I
things?
give it a positive? So to move from the cynical to the positive thing. So what we're trying to do to sort of update me and my colleagues do all sorts of different things to try and change the way in which we teach business to people. And in some ways it's a little bit of a response to your question. So one of the kind of positive things which we're trying to do to sort of change the way in which we teach business is next year all of our first year business students will be taught critical thinking in their first year, which is basic logic, reasoning, those kind of things which any person would be taught in most degrees, right? And we're using kind of scenario or case-based sort of reasoning to do that, taking them through thinking in the most basic way. And the reason we've done this is we were struck by the fact that most, particularly undergraduate students, are remarkably incapable often of thinking through basic, how do you use evidence, how do you use logical reasoning, how do you avoid basic cognitive biases, etc. So that's kind of one of the little nice stories, I guess. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree about the current state of business education, which isn't to say that there aren't some really interesting people doing some really interesting things. I mean, Cass Business School has had a whole nest of interesting people for quite a long time, and Andre's one of them. But my sense is if we look at the 13,000 business schools I mentioned, most of them, most of the time, are teaching very conventional forms of capitalist economics. Yeah, and that's not to say that there aren't some people doing stuff on discourse, narrative, identity, critique, whatever. Yeah, I just think most of it isn't that. We occupy a very curious fringe position within these kinds of debates. As for the kind of the status of the knowledge, respectfully, the problem with your argument is it kind of disqualifies the social sciences sort of to court, really, because according to your version of what a structural argument would look like, and I think we'd need to clarify this a lot more, I'm not sure how many social sciences could qualify as putting forward structural propositions. Lots of social scientists do use talk of structure and so on, but I for myself, I don't think that the problem is the status of the knowledge within the business school. I think the problem is the existence of the business school itself and the way in which it tessellates with a particular economic order. And just to pick up on something Andre said, because it is a really important point, I'd be pretty stupid if I thought that by changing business schools we were going to change capitalism. Yeah, that's a dumb argument. But at the same time, that's not a zero-sum argument. It's fairly clear to me that business schools are one of the places. They are, I think, described rhetorically as madrasas for a particular kind of economic form. So it seems to me that, since this is my backyard, then I do have a certain kind of responsibility to address those questions. Not assuming somehow that, once people are no longer teaching, I don't know, whatever it is, principal agent economics, that suddenly capitalism is going to collapse or something like that. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. But it'd be pretty daft to ignore the fact that huge numbers of young people are going through these institutions and being educated in the seeming inexorability of a particular political and economic form. Just a very quick one. Have you heard this figure, the Australian figure?
I don't think it's good.
No.
I don't know. I haven't lived there for years.
Okay,
It doesn't sound right to me.
It sounds excessive to me
And
as
it
well.
doesn't
Yes.
where all the
I don't-
medicos and the lawyers and
Yeah.
all the rest of it. I
Yeah.
can't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Business schools have been described as bastions of capitalism, corporate capitalism, market fundamentalism. But in one of the courses here, we looked closely. We had a close look at, I think it was the Harvard MBA. I think it was a guy called Michael Porter. And almost all the content was about how to subvert the free market. How to eliminate competition. Not only how to avoid regulations, but how to distort the regulatory process so that it gets rid of your competitors rather than you.
Beautiful.
That's actually right. Paul.
Yes, I'm very sorry I wasn't here for your talk, but I've just spent the day on a symposium on minimum income standards. And I wanted to come to this particular meeting because I want to know whether the business schools are teaching the merits of the living wage and how it improves your company and the merits of bringing in-house things like cleaners, because that's what KPMG did after we campaigned with them. So that's one question. And the other question is, I have a diploma in personnel management, which was taken a very long time ago because it was called a diploma in personnel management.
Yeah.
It would now be called a diploma in human resources or something.
Talent management.
I don't know what the name now is. But I was then put into, got a job in ICI in Central Personnel Department as the personnel officer on the negotiating team with the trade unions. And we were restructuring the whole company in something much called a weekly staff agreement. And there I learned all about Hertzberg and McGregor and creating interesting jobs. And a generally sort of moral approach to management from the point of view of working with and for the people who work for you. And I was massively impressed, I have to say. I just wonder whether that kind of moral emphasis is surging through the business schools these days.
Jamie?
Martin, you were saying sort of, I really like your historical stuff, by the way, and the rest of the book as well, it's really good thing.
Sorry, say again.
I really like the historical side of things.
Okay.
So you talk
At least
about
that's one bit you like, that's okay. I'm feeling the rest of it's not going to be so good. Anyway, carry on.
The sort of the original American business school model that you're talking about was sort of to introduce, or part of it anyway, was introducing that code of conduct and ethics to make it more respectable and professional. Why do you think that's changed? What's behind it? And I would have thought probably very linked about Andre. You're saying there are other things that have created the corporate capitalism we have now that are far more important than the business school. Could you give what they are?
Okay, so Harvard's not so bad. Have we got minimum, the benefits of actually paying the workforce a living wage? And
I can start. Yeah. So on this point about the living wage, so kind of the living wage, and then I'll talk about your point, and then come back to your second point. So on the living wage, I think many courses would indeed include there be some debate about the role of how much you pay workers and questions about living wage. So I include that in some of my courses. People who would teach human resource management would also get into those kinds of debates about the necessities of paying your employees to a living wage. So I think that will be kind of standard fare in many business schools across the world. Standard textbooks would pick that up. People might question it, but at least it would be mentioned, I think.
I meant, of course, the real living wage, not Oswald's living wage.
Yes, of course. So I think it would be less mentioned. People might kind of question it. It might be indeed a side issue, but it's there. To your point on do people actually teach the undermining of the free market? Hell yes. So there was a paper which came out just a few weeks ago by a guy called David Barron, who's at Stanford Business School. It's quite an interesting paper about Uber. And it looks at basically makes the point that Uber's problems aren't competitive problems. They're basically what they call non-market strategy problems, which is how do you manipulate government regulation and engage with debates about government regulation. And if you look at a lot of the work which is done in corporate strategy courses now, so Martin makes the point in the book is that often the kind of pinnacle of an MBA course is corporate strategy, which is often rather vague and broad and so forth. But what they spend a lot of time thinking about now is this question about non-market strategy, which is how do you change or manipulate or engage the regulatory framework around what you're doing, often to get rid of competition, which was kind of Uber's shtick, or to create a nice playing field for yourself or you. So often these political questions are built into what's taught in MBA programs, and you can question that, etc., but that's what it is. And to finally get back to your point about the humanizing of management, this Hertzberg and so forth are kind of standard fare on the kind of courses that Martin and I might teach in the first year or start of MBAs. We might talk about motivation and so on. So it's a very standard component. If you then update kind of where that's at now, probably one of the most well-known kind of contemporary management thinkers in the US is a guy called Adam Grant, who's kind of fairly young guy, and he's most well known for this idea of give and take. So his idea that giving is very good for you in the workplace. So it's a humanistic theme is certainly there, but then you can, I guess, as Martin would do, question the role that plays and often make the point that that's just used to exploit people more.
Yeah. I mean, Andre's right, and he prefigures some of my responses, I suppose. Let me just use one example. So very often in kind of soft, humanistic type management stuff, grows out of Maslow, Hertzberg, those kind of things. People might talk about empowering workers. Clearly, the paradox of that is that it still embeds the idea of a managerial hierarchy who have the power and who then can kindly empower others and presumably could disempower them too. So usually the discussions about the more humanistic stuff are still framed within assumptions about the nature of a capitalist economy and the forms of organisation that have to exist within it. So I still think that even though you might find examples, and plenty of examples of kind of soft stuff within the business school, that they're still effectively boxed within something which is more pernicious, really. Responding to the kind of the free market arguments, I don't think there's any necessary relation between arguments about free markets and what the business school actually does. The idea of the market as some kind of useful mechanism is common across a whole variety of different forms of discourse, and it can be interpreted in more or less purist kind of ways. But I think both you and stimulated by your question that very often the approach towards the market is effectively to use it when it's useful and to cheat when it's not. So to find ways of externalizing your costs, whatever it is, or minimizing your tax position, whatever it might be. These would be routine ways of trying to escape certain kind of rule-based structures. The idea of a completely free market is a kind of, that's a sort of, I don't know, it's a bit like absolute zero or something. It's like a kind of a hypothetical condition that some economists might be interested in. But it would rarely be that important, I think, within the context of business and management education.
So market opportunists rather than market fundamentalists. I'm joking.
That's a nice way of expressing it, I think. But except in so far as there is a fundamentalism about the assumption that some version of the market should exist in all circumstances. So, however rigged and complicated it might be, however regulated it might be, that we need the market as a mechanism in all areas of life. That would be a form of fundamentalism, but certainly a very variegated understanding of what markets were.
But this brings to mind a rather strange kind of experience I had recently. I met a couple of people who I think you might know, who took a trip to North Korea, and they went to a business school which had been set up in North Korea to visit the Pyongyang Startup Week. And they had a bunch of people who were part of a technology university in North Korea, which had been set up by an entrepreneur from somewhere based, I can't remember where he was from, I think from Hong Kong or maybe South Korea. And they'd trained kind of the North Korean elites as in part of this business school. Most of the faculty came from offshore, and most of them were fundamentalist Christians, and they would train them. They were there for a week to train them in this kind of startup thing. So they took them through the kind of typical ways in which you would teach a startup course, which is called the business model canvas, and they had to kind of develop these business models for these enterprises which would be launched in North Korea. So often it showed the kind of rather strange and farcical kind of things which go on within business schools, and in some ways it backs up Martin's kind of strange, the argument that they're spread globally, but often they're kind of completely decoupled from actual free markets. You can find there's some reports on these kind of this university if you want to look on. I think there's a piece on Quartz on this particular university, and people who are writing about this Pyongyang Startup Week if you want to find out.
Great. We'll take some over here.
I would just like to expand on what you said about externalities, and I would like to point out that the argument that the fact that the business school is supporting the chemistry department or whichever department is in itself an externality. We are in a way teaching or indoctrinating, whichever way, a generation, successive generations in a specific form of economics. I would also like to point out, however, that it was assumed that the reason for this is the high levels of debt, and that students undergo have 50,000 in debt. Obviously, you want to pay that off. I would just like to point out that the business school phenomenon is global. However, the fees are mostly local. Lots of countries do not have these fees. In Portugal, you pay 1,000 euros a year. It's different, 5,000 to 50,000 in debt. In Germany, I believe it's free. So I'd like to point out this. However, there is a demand for this kind of knowledge, this kind of jargon, and not really for the knowledge itself, but sometimes just for the certificate. And the reasons, speaking from some colleagues of mine that went to business school, they tend to be more money motivated, or if not money motivated, in the absence of a specific motivation, I might as well go and make money.
Lost.
So there is that.
I'm particularly interested in the influence of economic theory on business school teaching, and there's a lot of discussion these days about problems with economics, particularly because one school is dominant, neoclassical school of economics is completely dominant still. And also within that, I mean, I work in the financial sector, so I'm particularly interested in financial economics, which I understand is taught in business schools, but not so much anywhere else. And that influences corporate finance and the way that the financial system operates. So, which has, as we all know, financial system has a lot of problems, short-termism, boom and bust, and so on. So, do you think that if there was reform in economics, would that be beneficial to business schools?
Last one, this one.
Well, I was going to ask about students, follow up to some of the other comments and questions. I'm just wondering, are they all sort of docile proto-capitalists, or do they come and question some of the doctrines that they're hearing about? You know, they will have come across Marx, they will have come across environmental problems, you know, at school if nowhere else. You know, issues of environmental degradation, climate change. You know, do they not come and critique what they're hearing with, you know, knowledge that they bring to the course, or are they just blank canvases?
So would you like to start on that?
Can I address that one directly? Because for me, it's a really hard and really easy question. So when I was doing kind of versions of this before I'd kind of formulated the whole argument, people would say, what about students? You know, how are you going to persuade students to come to your new school for organising when they could just be making shekels? Yeah, that kind of thing. And then I had to write a chapter up which I called "What Do Students Want?" So how can we think about students in the context of a reformed or whatever version of business education? And it seems to me that the problem is in part one of universities I'm making in the UK. I accept the qualifications with that. And that's the way in which business schools at universities in general now effectively market their courses as being opportunities for advancement of various kinds, that kind of stuff. And then, you know, the whole idea of ranking universities in terms of the starting salaries of graduates, which was recently proposed by whatever his name is, a Tory minor minister or something. So there's this sort of assumption. But it seems to me that, you know, with the kind of people that we're dealing with, particularly the undergraduates, are not stupid. They very often enter classrooms with knowledge about climate change and about inequality and dispossession, all the rest of it. I was doing a talk to the first year graduates at Bristol the other day, and I started off with the idea of homelessness. So, you know, many of them have walked to that lecture theatre in the centre of Bristol, walking past people who, you know, are sleeping in doorways and so on. So let's start with that stuff. Instead of telling them that everything is fine and your life is going to be great if you get a degree and you can earn loads of money and all the rest of it, tell them about, you know, treat them like grown-ups. And when you do that, they respond to it, because rather than, you know, shuffling out the usual crap, the fairy dust about how everything's going to be all right, they're actually presented with a version of the world which is the world that they've seen, the world that they've experienced. Now, it seems to me if we begin with students in that way, we're much more likely then to be able to encourage them to become the sort of critical, questioning citizens with a variety of different ways of thinking about value and business and politics and the rest of it that I'd like to encourage. But that has to begin with the way that the university pitches the course in the first place, doesn't it? Because when it's still, you know, you look at marketing for business schools and it's just shameful, it's awful. You know, it's kind of like mobile phone advertising or something, which basically lifestyles are being sold. You know, I just think it's dreadful, really. And I would kind of begin with that sort of assumption. I know it's happening. I mean, you know, the political economy of universities means that they want to maximise da-da-da-da, but I think we've got to treat students with a bit more respect than that.
Actually, it's quite a good strategy for students never to earn enough to pay their pay.
Yeah.
Well, one of my kids just moved to Canada. There's an externality.
So what about financial economics? Is that or
sorry,
I'm going to give you two contradictory responses. One is to say that if you look at economics as a field today, I don't think it's accurate to say, I mean, academic economics, I don't think it's accurate to say that it's dominated by neoclassical economics anymore. I'd say that if you look at most of the Nobel Prize, you know, a good number of the Nobel Prizes recently, many of them have been this kind of behavioural economics, and then you can get into a kind of debate about whether behavioural economics is just kind of neoclassical economics with a bit of like nice stuff on the edges of it. But I think that there's some more diversity in the world of kind of academic economics now. It's not completely as diverse as one would want, but I think there's some increasing diversity in it, and outside of that in political economy certainly there is. So that's the kind of positive side. The negative side of it is that if you actually go and look at what's going on within financial economics in particular, but actual practicing economics, say in government policy or regulators and so forth, often they begin with this idea of coming up with a fantasy of a perfectly functioning market, and you might put a bit of behavioural nudges around the edges of that. And a number of my colleagues at CAS are interested in this idea of performativity, which is essentially the argument is that you build an economic model, and then when you build that into the software systems or whatever which make prices for markets, it actually makes the model into reality. So essentially reality begins to fit the model rather than the model fitting reality. And that can have rather disastrous consequences over time, as we've seen. So I think that's a big question which we need to kind of get our hands around. And often reality is far more complex than the models are, I guess.
Okay, Janos, but this time shorter.
Yeah, the shortest was there are science courses at universities, and you don't raise the question as to shut them down. And the reason I think is because they deliver the goods. There is a matching between the methods and theories of science and what the courses teach. And in my opinion, the problem you raised is much wider than restricted to business schools. The same kind of problem has arisen in engineering, social sciences, and anywhere where there are human activities, purposive human activities. And this is the core of the problem, I think. That is what should be tackled by developing the appropriate theoretical approach to this kind of problem.
Okay, but we're going to...
On the back of this consideration, I would say that maybe the problem that the universities face in general, and business school in particular, is inherited because of the kind of education that children and then young adults have been bombarded with for many years, since very young age. So what I'm trying to say is that we have in the Western countries, and Italian, but also in the UK, I see that an inadequate education, an inadequate schooling system that teaches an approach based on punishment and rewards, that teaches conformity, that make young children already at that young age lose all enthusiasm and all ability, or almost all ability, to think critically. So no wonder why you inherited this kind of students when they get at 18 years old or so on. So I'm not surprised that universities are harboring a dysfunctional environment if the previous schooling system is dysfunctional as well.
So we really are that. Where you play something, Tony?
You like?
Yeah.
I'm Johnny Allen. I'm a water scientist, and I got into a problem because water science and water is important, but it is only when you realise that it is farmers who manage it. So farmers are in a production system, the food system, and the question that I'm going to ask you is about accountancy. I have a prejudice that economics departments and business schools don't help us with having good accounting rules. We've got some accounting rules, but we don't have enough accounting rules. And there's no imagination to push into other areas. The other idea I want to underpin this with is that, do you teach in business schools that you can't have a market, free or whatever, without there being underpinning market rules, which are not fixed by the players, they're fixed by governments. And so if the work hasn't gone into putting those rules in, then you can't have the tunes and things that you play in the market. But in the food supply chain, we've got three parts. The middle part is full of corporates and the stuff that business school people will enter and go into. 90% of the added value of the product, the commodity, is in that part. So they've got, and we have taken as a society the precaution of making sure there are accounting rules there which make it possible to make a profit and pay taxes. But in the production part, where all the water is, we don't want to account for a whole range of things which are desperately elementally important. Is there, I haven't met anyone in the corporate sector who can do other than wave arms at this idea that we must look after the environment, when what we need is to put in the accounting rules, to put in the legislation to make sure that we can have a market if you want to run it that way. If we don't want to run it that way, then we have to continue to run it as a failed market. Why do you teach about failed markets? It's apparently they're very, very, very normal. But so, what about accountants? Have we got? Do you? Again, the accounting industry is irresponsible too. You know, when you start pushing them, eyes glaze. They don't want to push any further with the accounting rules, which are essential. So I feel that, you know, your lot don't teach this stuff.
So we've got three different things. It's a problem with all disciplines. It's a problem actually with how people are educated, and it's a problem with missing out accounting, understanding the rules around markets, etc.
Can I give it a quick response? I think this is a fantastic and interesting point about accountancy and water. We've not thought about the implications of that, but there is quite a sizable field called environmental accounting. For instance, I'd point you towards this. I think there's a group at St Andrews University who specialises in this area. There's a guy called Crawford Spence who works at Warwick University who specialises on this area. So I think they're kind of interested in the effects, the kind of social and political effects which accountancy rules have on things like, you know, green issues and so forth. Maybe they're not addressing your specific issue, but there's a whole kind of field doing that kind of work. I can't give you any more detail on that. The point which you raise, I would take not so much the question about what is taught in schools, but the way in which schools are kind of governed and run. I recently wrote a book which was looking at the kind of spread of management jargon and kind of needless managerial work across all sectors. And I was particularly exercised by the question of schools, you know, having young children. And when I went along to my daughter's school recently, we were given a lengthy PowerPoint presentation about the strategy and the planning and the branding of the school and this and that, you know, like flow charts and all of this sort of stuff. And I sort of started thinking, what's going on here? I go and do some research. What does teachers spend their time doing in schools in the UK? Teachers in the UK work the longest hours, which is about 46 hours on average. They spend, on average, I think it was 18 hours face-to-face with children. So then you have to ask the question, what do they do in those other hours? The answer is, part of it's behavioural management, you know, dealing with basically cleaning up all of the social problems in the school. But a big part of it is filling in rules, complying with regulations, filling in forms, da-da-da-da. If we look at the best performing school system it used to be in the world, now it's Europe, which is Finland, teachers work about 31 hours and they spend 21 hours face-to-face with students, right? So in some ways what we've got is a story of how the kind of stuff which we teach in business schools, managerialism, kind of impacts on other areas which are things like schools, and makes matters worse by not necessarily kind of making the tasks more efficient, but essentially crowding out the time which people have to actually do their central job, which is teach face-to-face with students.
Let me just try and pull some of these things together. So I think
that's a good idea, because we're coming towards the end. So I think, and then maybe Andre can have a final.
Yeah. Oh, all right.
That's my.
That's your final. Okay, Martin, you have the final word.
Okay. Let me appeal, because I kind of like it, to the idea of the university and the more modern notion of what social sciences do within university. So the business school is clearly part of social science. It employs economics, psychology, sociology, and so on. You know, the kind of panoply of ideas which have been developed within the social sciences over the last 150 years, okay? So it seems to me that in a variety of other social science disciplines, my background is in sociology, as I said before, then there is a clear understanding that the ways in which structure and action within society operates is political. It has political effects in terms of the distributions of power and status. So you can talk about questions of gender and class and all that, you know, all this stuff. If you like, the picture of the social is one that is thoroughly understood in terms of it being shaped by interests. Okay. But if we turn to the business school, and this is kind of echoing what I was saying towards the end of my talk, really, that much of that social context has effectively been stripped out and replaced with some ideas about an universalizing set of rules and strategies which can allow for the maximization of profit by particular organized forms. Now, accounting is a really interesting case of this. I don't know that much about accounting, but we've got some fantastic, critical accounting colleagues who tell me that, if you really want to understand something about the way that businesses operate, you need to understand the way that accountants and accounting practices shape assumptions about efficiency, profitability, that kind of stuff. Which is a bit like saying, the argument that what's really important about the internet is the algorithms. We need to understand the ways in which the algorithms operate, if we want to understand, why things pop up on our Facebook feeds or whatever it might be, that kind of stuff. Now, it seems to me that in both cases, the accounting one and the more general question of the business school, that really all that we need to do, as if it were easy, is insist that business is that studying business and management is a social science, yeah, and that it has to engage with the same kind of political, ethical, historical problems as the rest of the social sciences. And I don't think that's a big ask. I think it's no more than asking, going back to the idea of the university, that it should be a proper discipline, not, as I suggest there, just a finishing school, or somewhere where you network. And in that, I am appealing to, a pretty classical notion of the university and what the university should be doing. Yeah? And I think, though I have my scepticisms about that and so on, I think that discursively that's a really helpful thing for us to do, to say, make it into a proper discipline. That's all we're asking. That's all I'm asking. Not something that is so partial, so focused, so so exclusionary in its epistemological assumptions. Yeah.
So one possible alternative
go
to
on.
this, he's making an argument that the university should, the business school should become more part of the university. You could make an argument which is the absolute opposite, which is to say that the major problem we've had is the universitisation, if you want, horrible word, of schools more generally. So for instance, if we take the case of Australia, I did my PhD at the University of Melbourne, which has sort of taken over all sorts of different schools. So the Victoria College of the Arts, which used to be a lovely art school doing all sorts of other sort of things, which it is, still has become part of the University of Melbourne. It suddenly has to have research and do this and that and the other thing. Here in, we see many schools which are doing very unusual things in higher education get included into the university structure, and therefore they lose all their characteristics. Recently I've been doing a tiny bit of work, just sitting into 1 or 2 classes at the Architecture Association here in London, which isn't part of a university. And it's amazing to me that this is in some ways how I would love to structure education, where they do things in completely different ways to what we do, and they're resisting being included into a large university because they know if they are, you'll get this hegemonization of the particular university, sort of university, everything will have to start looking like a university and becoming more disciplined and probably more boring. That's a good one.
Right, well, I'd like to thank very much Martin and Andre for a very stimulating conversation and presentation. Thank you very much. And you for asking lots of good questions and joining in. I'd just like to say before we break for wine, this is the end of our sort of summer season of talks. And August, we're not having a talk in August. And because everyone's meant to go away on holiday, but it's been so hot here, and anyway, holidays at that time of year are very expensive, so this may be old-fashioned, but our next event is in September on finance and sustainability with Nick Silver and the program manager from Financial Innovation Lab. Then we've got something on innovation with Michael Grubb. And I think land tax in November, and then December on growth. They're all in my computer at the moment, and I have to now populate our website so you can see the program. We've also actually got 3 events in September, sort of marking sort of 10 years after Lehman's, the crash of Lehman's, including an event on reflecting on where economics is. And with John Kay and some other people we're looking for. Also on the 15th of September, which is precisely the day 10 years later that Lehman crashed, we've got an event, afternoon event here, looking at the sort of global situation 10 years later, inequality, financialization, power and control of knowledge, and I think there's another theme, a sort of afternoon event with a whole range of speakers. And we've also actually, which links to the topic of financial shareholder value and whether it's dead as a concept or not, we've got an event on the 20th of September on towards a stakeholder economy and imagining, if shareholder value as the single sort of driver of the economy is dead, what is the alternative? How do you actually have organisations that have wider public purpose? Do they need to be accountable for that? If they are, how would that work? How could you democratise the economy? Do you need to democratise the economy? And beginning to imagine and think, well, how would that really work in practice? So all of that will be up on our new website. Promoting Economic Pluralism is soon going to have a new, fresh website, which we'll be launching in the next week or 2 if it all comes together. So I hope you'll join us in the autumn for this, this huge range of events. Which should also be hopefully very stimulating. But thank you very much, everyone. And there's wine and Chris, there's all normal, and so do keep talking. Thank you. Yes, stop it. Yeah.